For the valiant airmen of the 8th Air Force, a profound dread of anti-aircraft artillery, commonly known as Flak, surpassed their apprehension of enemy fighter aircraft. As the summer of 1943 unfolded, German interceptors, though formidable, could often be repelled or deterred by the cohesive strength of close bomber formations and the protective presence of their accompanying escort fighters. However, the ominous dark convolutions of exploding 88mm shells, a constant and terrifying threat, persistently pursued the bomber squadrons throughout their perilous journeys to their designated targets. The stark statistical evidence painted a grim and unequivocal picture. A staggering nearly 70% of all B-17 Flying Fortress losses sustained during missions over German territory were directly attributable to relentless anti-aircraft fire, rather than the agile attacks of Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. Consequently, bomber crews often expressed a preference for confronting a formidable squadron of a dozen Luftwaffe fighters over the harrowing ordeal of navigating a dense flak barrage, such as those encountered over heavily defended industrial centers like Schweinfurt or the crucial Ruhr Valley. The lethal efficacy of German flak extended far beyond the sheer quantity of ordnance discharged. Indeed, the German military had meticulously transformed anti-aircraft defense into an exact science, a highly refined and industrialized art of aerial denial. Each pivotal industrial complex within the Reich was formidably encircled by extensive batteries deploying both the renowned 88mm and the more potent 105mm artillery pieces. Yet the true devastating potency of these defenses originated not merely from the guns themselves, but from the intricate integrated system that orchestrated their operation. German flak crews did not simply elevate their formidable weapons towards the heavens in a desperate gamble. Instead, they employed remarkably sophisticated predictive technology. This advanced apparatus possessed the uncanny ability to precisely compute a bomber's projected position approximately 30 seconds into the future, meticulously factoring in its current velocity, operational altitude, and precise directional vector. The chilling reality for Allied airmen was that the explosive shells were already detonating within that calculated specific segment of airspace by the precise moment their aircraft arrived. The prevailing American bomber tactics employed throughout 1942 and extending into early 1943 inadvertently rendered the task of the German anti-aircraft gunners considerably simpler, almost effortless. The Army Air Forces had meticulously crafted a strategic doctrine centered upon the principle of precision daylight bombing, a methodology that inherently necessitated prolonged, unswervingly straight and level bomb runs. The highly touted Norden bomb sight, a marvel of contemporary engineering, was critically dependent upon an utterly stable platform for its optimal operation. Any even minor deviation from a steady course during the crucial final minutes preceding the bombs away command would inevitably compromise and severely diminish bombing accuracy. Consequently, B-17 Flying Fortress formations would adopt a steadfast and unwavering posture approximately 10 to 15 miles from their intended objective, locking onto a designated initial point, and then meticulously maintain an arrow-straight trajectory at a constant altitude and unvarying airspeed. This rigid flight path persisted until the lead bombardier ultimately initiated the release sequence. Each subsequent aircraft within the formation would then faithfully mimic the trajectory of the lead's ordnance. Stay with us to witness the conclusion of this compelling narrative, We would be immensely grateful for your kind like and subscription. Please also share in the comments where you are from and your thoughts on the crucial topic discussed in this video. For the crews enduring these harrowing sorties, those final 3 to 5 minutes prior to bomb release stretched into an agonizing eternity. Initially, they would observe the nascent flak bursts emerging ahead, merely diminutive black puffs that, from a deceptive distance, conveyed an almost innocuous appearance. However, as the aircraft plunged directly into these lethal concentrations, the entire airframe would violently shudder and recoil from the concussive force of numerous near misses. Shrapnel, propelled with immense velocity, would then mercilessly tear through the aircraft's fragile aluminum skin, producing a cacophony reminiscent of hailstones furiously pelting a tin roof. Yet, these were no ordinary hailstones. These deadly fragments possessed the capacity to instantaneously sever a vital hydraulic line, tragically incapacitate or kill a waist gunner, or catastrophically ignite a fuel tank. The acrid, pungent odor of cordite would insidiously permeate the flight deck, filtering through countless tiny punctures in the fuselage. Crucially, deviation was not an option. Pilots were compelled to rigorously maintain their position within the formation, preserve their assigned altitude, and steadfastly hold their heading, all while the German predictive systems meticulously calculated their impending demise with chilling mechanical precision. This inherent and unavoidable predictability of American bombing runs proved to be a tragically fatal vulnerability for the Allied aircrews. Each bombardier, in order to achieve the required accuracy, absolutely necessitated identical operational conditions, an unyielding and stable bombing platform, an unblemished and clear sight picture through the Norden, and crucially the complete absence of any evasive maneuvers. Correspondingly, every pilot meticulously adhered to the exact same flight profile, a rigid adherence dictated by the stringent demands of their training manuals and operational directives. The German defense strategists were acutely aware of this tactical constraint. Their astute flak officers had assiduously studied American aerial tactics, precisely timed the duration of typical bomb runs, and meticulously charted the common approach patterns. They possessed intimate knowledge that once a B-17 formation irrevocably committed to its bombing run, it would steadfastly maintain a consistent course, typically at an altitude of precisely 25,000 feet, with only minor variations of a few hundred feet, and at a steady airspeed of 180 miles per hour. This foreknowledge allowed the sophisticated predictive systems to be pre-programmed and calibrated well in advance, awaiting the bomber's inevitable arrival. By the advent of spring 1943, the veteran bomber crews found themselves grimly weighing the relative perils of their missions. Engagements with enemy fighter aircraft, though undeniably terrifying in their ferocity, were typically fleeting and contained. A Focke-Wulf 190, for instance, would execute its lightning-fast attack pass and then disengage and break away within a matter of mere seconds. Flak, in stark contrast, presented an impersonal, yet utterly relentless threat. It shadowed the aircraft relentlessly through the entirety of the target area, forming an impenetrable, shimmering curtain of steel that crews were compelled to breach to accomplish their vital mission. Some air crews recounted navigating through barrage concentrations of such extreme density that the explosions appeared continuous, an unyielding, rolling wall of dense black smoke punctuated by searing red-orange flashes. A terrifying spectacle that the formation had no choice but to stoically endure. The seasoned, older hands would often counsel newly arrived crews with a stoic pragmatism, advising them that such existential dread was best suppressed. Instead, one simply strapped oneself into the aircraft, resolutely pointed the nose towards the objective, and silently harbored the fervent hope that their individual fate was not inscribed upon one of those incoming shells. The established bombing doctrine, with its stringent demands for precision, appeared to be an immutable and unbreakable tenet of aerial warfare. Precision bombing, by its very definition, mandated an equally precise and unvarying flight profile. However, the grim reality was that countless men were perishing daily within those tragically predictable straight lines, leading some thoughtful pilots to begin questioning whether an alternative, less suicidal approach might exist. The core instrument responsible for rendering German flak so extraordinarily lethal was housed within robust concrete bunkers strategically positioned adjacent to every gun battery, the Kommando Juret 40. This remarkable device was a sophisticated mechanical computer capable of predicting the future, trajectory and position of an enemy bomber with an almost uncanny and frightening accuracy. This was no longer a matter of mere guesswork or the seasoned judgment of experienced gunners visually tracking targets in the vast expanse of the sky. Instead, it was pure mathematics rendered tangible, an intricate symphony of gears and cams meticulously calculating complex ballistic solutions at a speed far exceeding the capabilities of any human crew. This formidable system represented the absolute vanguard of fire control technology for its era, and, tragically, American bomber crews were succumbing to its chillingly precise application. The intricate and deadly process commenced with the strategic deployment of highly specialized optical rangefinders meticulously positioned around the perimeter of each anti-aircraft battery. These advanced stereoscopic instruments, some boasting impressive base lengths of nearly 5 meters, possessed the capability to ascertain the precise distance to a target aircraft operating at altitudes reaching up to 40,000 feet. Highly trained operators diligently tracked the incoming bomber formations through their sophisticated optics, continuously transmitting vital range data to the Central Commando Juret via a network of electrical signals. Concurrently, other dedicated operators were responsible for accurately measuring the target's azimuth, or horizontal bearing, and its elevation angle. Thus, 3 distinct yet interconnected streams of crucial information, encompassing range, bearing, and altitude, converged and flowed seamlessly into the predictive computer every few seconds, forming the foundational input for its deadly calculations. Within the intricate confines of the Kommando Juret, a bewildering maze of precision mechanical calculators sprang into action, processing the incoming data with astonishing speed and accuracy. The sophistication of this device was such that it did not merely record the bomber's instantaneous position at any given moment, rather its primary function was to meticulously compute precisely where the bomber would be located at the exact instant the fired shell ultimately reached its target. To illustrate this critical time delay, an 88mm round discharged from an altitude of 25,000 feet required approximately 30 seconds to ascend and reach its intended target altitude. During this seemingly short but crucial 30-second interval, A B-17 Flying Fortress, maintaining an airspeed of 180 miles per hour, would traverse a considerable distance of approximately 1.5 miles. The Commandogerate was engineered to meticulously account for this significant travel time, in addition to factoring in complex variables such as prevailing wind drift, local air density, ambient temperature, and the specific ballistic characteristics inherent to the particular ammunition being deployed. An elaborate interplay of precisely engineered cams and gears seamlessly meshed together, effectively performing advanced calculus through a marvel of mechanical analog computation. The critical output generated by this formidable predictor system was then transmitted directly to the gun layers manning each individual anti-aircraft weapon. Dials prominently displayed on every 88mm gun continuously received precise, real-time positional updates encompassing the exact elevation angle, the necessary traverse bearing, and crucially, the precise fuse setting required for the shell. German time fuses, by 1943, had achieved a remarkable degree of accuracy, capable of being set with astonishing precision, down to mere tenths of a second. The Commandogerate meticulously calculated the exact fraction of a second each shell needed to detonate, ensuring that its lethal fragmentation pattern would materialize precisely within the bomber's predicted future position. Consequently, the dedicated loaders would swiftly and accurately set the fuse rings on each round according to the predictor's infallible solution, and then the gun would unleash its deadly projectile. In the chilling scenario where the bomber steadfastly maintained its predetermined course and speed, the intricate mathematical prediction proved absolutely perfect, leading to devastating consequences for the Allied air crews. The intricate science of ballistics had been perfected. A proficiently trained German anti-aircraft artillery unit possessed the capability to launch an impressive 6 projectiles per gun each minute. A standard heavy flak battery typically comprised between 6 and 8 such formidable weapons, all meticulously synchronized and controlled by a single Commandogerate, the advanced fire control computer. This sophisticated arrangement translated into a formidable deluge of 40 to 50 explosive shells ascending into the atmosphere every 60 seconds, each one detonating at a location determined with astonishing precision. The predictive device would incessantly refine its targeting solution, incorporating fresh data from tracking instruments, thereby effectively guiding the lethal curtain of explosions along the anticipated trajectory of the incoming bomber. The ultimate outcome was the creation of a deadly volumetric space, saturated with razor-sharp steel shrapnel, meticulously timed to materialize at the exact spatial coordinates occupied by the aerial bomber formation. However, the efficacy of this ingenious system hinged upon a singular, critical prerequisite: the necessity for the target to exhibit entirely predictable conduct. The complex algorithms embedded within the Commandogerate's computational core were predicated on the assumption that the aerial target would steadfastly uphold its prevailing velocity vector. Should a bomber abruptly alter its elevation or modify its airspeed, the meticulously derived predictive solution would instantly lose its validity and become useless. Yet the German strategists were intimately acquainted with American tactical doctrine. Through the diligent acquisition of captured training manuals, the systematic interrogation of prisoners of war, and the painstaking observation of hundreds of aerial bombardment sorties, they had gleaned crucial insights. They understood that once a B-17 formation stabilized itself for its bombing approach, it would rigorously adhere to unwavering flight parameters for a crucial window of 3 to 5 minutes. Consequently, the commandograade had been meticulously engineered with the express purpose of capitalizing upon this inherent and exploitable predictability in enemy behavior. By the middle of 1943, the profound effectiveness of this automated anti-aircraft defense mechanism became empirically demonstrable through statistical analysis, particularly over formidable German strongholds such as Bremen, Hamburg, and the vital industrial heartlands of the Ruhr. Anti-aircraft batteries were consistently achieving unprecedented hit rates, levels of accuracy that would have been utterly unattainable through conventional, manually directed gunnery methods. Subsequent damage assessments conducted after bombing missions revealed a stark reality. The vast majority of bombers limping back to their bases in England bore unmistakable signs of flak damage, with the explosive shells detonating at precisely the intended altitude. These deadly fragments were not scattering haphazardly. Rather, they were punctually arriving at the precise locations that the sophisticated predictors had calculated they would. The mechanical intellects of the commandograade were decisively prevailing in this intricate mathematical contest, leaving American air crews without a viable countermeasure. They were, in essence, adhering strictly to their established operational doctrine and thereby flying directly into a meticulously constructed computational snare. And the prospect of altering that deeply ingrained doctrine appeared insurmountable. The highly acclaimed Norden bomb sight, a cornerstone of their precision bombing strategy, imperatively demanded a stable flight path. And this very stability was precisely the critical condition that the commandograade required to inflict devastating casualties. It was clear that a fundamental change was inevitable. Yet in the sweltering summer of 1943, the precise nature of this impending something remained an elusive mystery to all concerned. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The fateful date of August 17th, 1943, would forever be etched into history as the pivotal moment that compelled a reevaluation of all established certainties. The audacious dual assault launched against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, both indispensable hubs for ball-bearing manufacturing and aircraft production, constituted the most profound incursion into German-controlled airspace that the formidable 8th Air Force had ever endeavored. While the architects of the mission had indeed anticipated a certain level of attrition, the grim reality that unfolded above those strategic objectives dramatically surpassed even their most pessimistic forecasts. Out of the 376 B-17 flying fortresses that valiantly lifted off from English airfields at dawn that morning, a staggering 60 never completed their perilous journey back. An additional 168 aircraft returned in such a severely crippled state that a significant number would regrettably be deemed irreparable and permanently grounded. The overall casualty rate soared to an alarming 20%, a figure that unequivocally transcended the sustainable threshold for any military undertaking, signaling an unsustainable operational cost. The ferocity of the anti-aircraft fire encountered over Schweinfurt was utterly unprecedented, a terrifying spectacle unlike anything the seasoned air crews had ever confronted. Gunners recounted witnessing barrages of such overwhelming density that the individual detonations coalesced into an unbroken, ominous black pall across the sky. A particular aviator from the 301st Bomb Group vividly narrated his harrowing experience of piloting his aircraft directly into what he perceived as an impenetrable barrier of smoke, where discrete explosions were indistinguishable, replaced instead by a tumultuous, churning maelstrom of lethal shrapnel and concussive blast waves that tossed his heavy bomber about with the violent capriciousness of a fragile leaf caught in a tempest. The fire, meticulously guided by the predictive systems, proved to be devastatingly precise. Explosive projectiles were observed detonating with unerring accuracy within the narrow altitude band of 23,000 to 26,000 feet, precisely the strata where the vulnerable bomber formation was most densely concentrated. Crucially, the grievous losses sustained were not disseminated in an arbitrary or haphazard fashion. Aircraft that rigorously adhered to the prescribed standard bombing profile, maintaining a steadfastly straight and level flight path at an unvarying altitude and consistent airspeed, bore the brunt of the most intense and destructive punishment. The lead bombardiers within each operational group, individuals whose critical role necessitated sustaining the most unwavering trajectory for the most extended duration, tragically incurred a disproportionately high number of casualties. It became evident that the German defenders had astutely developed a tactic to concentrate their devastating fire upon the leaders of the formations, understanding that successfully incapacitating or disrupting the lead aircraft would inevitably fragment the entire group's coordinated bombing pattern. Thus, the formidable Commando Jet Predictors were not merely operating with cold mechanical precision, but were being strategically directed with sophisticated tactical intelligence, enhancing their lethality significantly. Back at the nerve center of Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe, the grim statistical data arrived with the impact of a shattering bombshell, reverberating through the command staff. General Frederick Anderson and his dedicated personnel had consistently acknowledged that the demanding endeavor of daylight precision bombing would inherently entail substantial costs. However, these newly aggregated figures emphatically indicated that the overarching strategic approach itself might be fundamentally unsustainable. Unvarnished mathematics laid bare the stark reality of the situation. Should every deep penetration mission continue to incur a staggering 20% loss rate, the statistical probability of an individual crew successfully completing a full 25-mission combat tour plummeted to virtually nil. The critical pipeline for replacing combat losses was utterly incapable of keeping pace with such exorbitant attrition. Furthermore, the extensive training facilities across the United States were already operating at their absolute maximum capacity, yet they simply could not generate new air crews with sufficient rapidity to offset this devastating rate of depletion. The subsequent Schweinfurt raid, executed on October 14, 1943, unequivocally underscored and tragically confirmed the escalating crisis. This calamitous day, infamously christened Black Thursday, resulted in the loss of an additional 60 heavy bombers, alongside 17 more aircraft that sustained such irreparable damage they were officially declared beyond repair and struck from the inventory. The 8th Air Force had dispatched a formidable contingent of 291 B-17s against the crucial target, and by the close of that harrowing day, a total of 77 aircraft had vanished, representing an appalling 26% loss rate. While the vital ball-bearing manufacturing facilities had indeed been struck, the human and material cost of this tactical success proved utterly catastrophic. In the immediate aftermath of Black Thursday, the perilous deep penetration bombing missions were reluctantly and temporarily put on hold. The Grand Bomber Offensive, initially conceived as the crucial precursor to softening German defenses in preparation for the monumental D-Day landings, had been abruptly brought to a grinding halt by the formidable and increasingly effective German defensive apparatus. Consequently, dedicated intelligence officers commenced conducting exhaustive and meticulous debriefings, striving to discern any discernible patterns or anomalies that might elucidate why certain aircraft managed to endure the inferno, while others tragically succumbed. They painstakingly scrutinized the nature of flak damage on the battered bombers that limped back to base, carefully documenting the precise locations where explosive shells had detonated in relation to the aircraft's spatial coordinates. Furthermore, they conducted extensive interviews with both pilots and bombardiers, pressing them for precise recollections of the exact moments and locations where they had observed the most intense concentrations of enemy anti-aircraft fire. Gradually, a discernible pattern began to materialize from these detailed investigations, albeit one that initially appeared to defy conventional logic. A number of aircrews consistently reported that the flak bursts seemed to possess an uncanny ability to anticipate their aircraft's position, detonating marginally ahead of their current flight path, almost as if the German gunners possessed foreknowledge of their precise location before they even arrived there. This perception, it turned out, accurately reflected the true operational mechanics. Naturally, the Commandegerät had been specifically engineered to project and deliver shells to the bomber's calculated future position, rather than its immediate, present location. However, this recurring and intriguing observation ignited a profoundly crucial line of inquiry within the strategic minds of the operational planners. What if the bomber, by some means, failed to occupy that predicted future position? What fundamental alterations would occur if the critical assumptions underpinning the Predictors' complex calculations were deliberately and systematically violated? The established operational guidelines unequivocally prohibited any deviation from a fixed trajectory during the bomb run. Training manuals were meticulously detailed, underscoring this rigidity. The foundational premise of achieving accurate daylight bombing hinged entirely upon maintaining unwavering stability. Yet this very adherence to stability was exacting a terrible price in human lives. Consequently, a growing number of officers began to question the ultimate value of precision if the crews tasked with achieving it could not survive to observe their targets. The profound challenges encountered in August and October 1943 had effectively created a significant fissure in the long-held conventional wisdom, and it was through this emerging vulnerability that truly transformative innovations would eventually manifest. The initial instances of departing from this strict doctrine did not originate in the strategic planning rooms of headquarters, but rather in the cramped confines of bomber cockpits soaring over hostile German skies. Experienced pilots, many of whom had already completed an impressive 15 or 20 combat missions, increasingly found themselves prioritizing their trained instincts over the rigid prescriptions of their flight manuals. Captain Robert Morgan, whose distinguished service would later earn him widespread acclaim for guiding the Memphis Belle through her entire tour of duty, initiated subtle experimentation with minor altitude adjustments during his final approaches to targets in the latter part of 1943. His actions were not an outright defiance of orders, but rather a flexible interpretation of them. Crucially, his bombardier confirmed that acceptable sight pictures could still be acquired even when the aircraft gently ascended or descended by a few hundred feet during the crucial bombing phase. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Other flight crews also began to observe something quite extraordinary when they implemented these unsanctioned modifications to their flight paths. Lieutenant James McLaughlin, at the controls of a B-17 bomber christened Lucky Strike, recounted a particularly noteworthy event over Bremen in November 1943, an incident that subsequently became a topic of intense discussion in crew quarters for several weeks thereafter. His formation had diligently stabilized itself on the bomb run at an altitude of 24,000 ft when a barrage of intense anti-aircraft fire began to dangerously bracket their aircraft. McLaughlin, acting purely on instinct, pulled back on the yoke, causing his aircraft to gain approximately 400 ft in altitude over the subsequent minute. The flak bursts, which moments before had been perilously close, now unexpectedly detonated below his aircraft. He had, counterintuitively, ascended into what was theoretically expected to be a zone of even higher flak concentration. Yet the shells were exploding precisely where his aircraft had been moments before, not where it currently was. The underlying explanation for this phenomenon proved elusive for a time, primarily because it appeared to contradict all conventional wisdom. Every pilot's ingrained instinct dictated that one should always dive away from incoming flak, seeking to get below it and utilize gravity to swiftly accelerate out of the danger zone. However, McLaughlin's actions had involved climbing, and the flak had demonstrably missed. News of this remarkable incident rapidly disseminated through the 91st Bomb Group and its adjacent units. While some pilots were quick to dismiss it as a mere stroke of luck, perhaps attributing it to a coincidental adjustment in German gunners' aim, others cautiously began to experiment. They initiated small, controlled altitude changes during their bomb runs, meticulously noting the relative positions of the flak bursts compared to their newly adopted altitudes. Captain Charles Cruikshank, a member of the distinguished 303rd Bomb Group, undertook what essentially amounted to systematic field testing during his missions in December 1943. Prior to each sortie, he would thoroughly brief his crew, informing them of his intention to potentially deviate from the standard altitude profile during the bomb run, and specifically instructing his bombardier to report any perceived impact on bombing accuracy. Across 3 consecutive missions, targeting locations in northwestern Germany, Cruikshank initiated gentle climbs ranging from 500 to 800 ft, commencing approximately 2 minutes before the designated bomb's away point. His bombardier confirmed that the Norden site was capable of compensating for this steady climb rate, provided it remained consistent. More significantly, the flak that had been predicted for their original lower altitude consistently burst well below their aircraft's new position. The intricate physics of the situation only began to make coherent sense once pilots dedicated time to thoroughly analyze it. Those formidable 88mm shells typically required about 30 seconds to reach their predetermined altitude. If a German predictor system calculated that an aircraft would be at 24,000 ft in 30 seconds, but that aircraft was in fact steadily climbing at a rate of 100 ft per minute, it would effectively be at 24,500 ft when the shells finally arrived at their preset detonation altitude. This crucial time of flight inherently created an exploitable gap, a window of opportunity that altitude changes could effectively leverage. The Kommandogerät, the German anti-aircraft fire control computer, was undeniably accurate, but its calculations were based solely on the aircraft's observed behavior at the moment of calculation. By altering that behavior, the meticulously derived firing solution instantly became obsolete. Initially, this unconventional theory met with considerable skepticism. Operations officers voiced profound concerns regarding the potential compromise of formation integrity. Their apprehension stemmed from the belief that if individual pilots were permitted to freely climb and descend, the tightly coordinated defensive formations, vital for mutual protection, would inevitably disintegrate. Group commanders, for their part, worried about a degradation in bombing accuracy if bombardiers were compelled to operate from inherently unstable platforms. Furthermore, some senior staff officers viewed the entire concept as bordering on insubordination. Pilots were perceived as engaging in creative improvisation, when their duty was to strictly adhere to established procedures. The prevailing doctrine, after all, had been painstakingly developed by acknowledged experts, rigorously tested at bombardier schools, and repeatedly validated in the crucible of combat. The notion that such a well-established doctrine should be abandoned simply because a handful of pilots had developed alternative theories was widely resisted. However, the compelling evidence began to accumulate as those pioneering pilots consistently returned from missions, while others, adhering to the old ways, did not. By January 1944, a sufficient number of mission reports contained mentions of altitude variations and corresponding observations of flak patterns that intelligence officers could no longer disregard the emerging correlation. Crews that maintained rigid altitude discipline appeared to sustain more hits than those who strategically introduced variations. While this was not yet irrefutable scientific proof, it was undeniably suggestive. The data, though anecdotal and spread across dozens of mission debriefings and individual crew accounts, was coalescing into a clear pattern. The rigid, straight, and level approach demanded by established doctrine might, in fact, be precisely what the German predictors required to effectively target and destroy them. Innovation, born directly from the primal instinct for survival, was beginning to fundamentally challenge the textbook, and the mounting body of evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The tactic that would ultimately be credited with saving thousands of lives acquired its evocative name from the very action it seemingly defied: climbing into the flak. By early 1944, a critical mass of crews had sufficiently experimented with altitude changes, allowing the precise mechanics of the technique to crystallize into a refined methodology. This was not merely about executing random evasive maneuvers or panicked, uncontrolled ascents. Instead, it represented a meticulously calculated exploitation of the inherent time gap that existed between the moment German predictors finalized their calculations and the subsequent moment when those calculations manifested as exploding shells at a specific altitude. The optimal application of this technique involved initiating a steady, controlled climb of approximately 500 to 1,000 ft, during the final approach, commencing roughly 3 minutes before the designated bomb's away point. The precise timing of this maneuver was absolutely critical. Should the climb be initiated too early, the German tracking stations would simply feed the updated data into their commando Gerats, which would then recalculate for the bomber's new trajectory, negating the advantage. Conversely, if the climb was started too late, the bombardier would lack the necessary time to establish a stable sight picture prior to bomb release, jeopardizing accuracy. The ideal sweet spot for initiating this climb appeared to be within the 2.5 to 3 minute window before bombs away. At this precise juncture, German predictors had already finalized their firing solutions and had begun transmitting fuse settings to the anti-aircraft guns. Loaders on the ground were actively setting the time rings on the shells based on calculations that erroneously assumed the aircraft would remain at its original altitude. Those shells, already fused with incorrect settings, were, at that very moment, being rammed into the breeches of the waiting guns. The precise management of the aircraft's ascent rate held critical importance, rivaling the exactness of the timing itself. Should a pilot initiate an ascent too sharply or aggressively, the delicate integrity of the bomber formation could be severely compromised, simultaneously presenting the bombardier with an unacceptably unstable platform from which to perform his intricate calculations. Conversely, a climb executed with excessive gentleness would fail to provide the necessary vertical displacement required to effectively evade the predetermined burst zone of enemy anti-aircraft shells. Seasoned aviators, through extensive practical experience, discovered that a consistent and controlled climb rate, ideally maintained between 80 and 120 feet per minute, yielded the most favorable outcomes. For instance, sustaining a climb of 100 feet per minute for the 3 minutes leading up to the release of bombs would result in an altitude gain of approximately 300 feet. This incremental elevation was entirely sufficient to position the aircraft safely above the anticipated detonation points of shells aimed by enemy predictors, yet it was gentle enough to ensure that bombardiers could retain clear sight pictures and meticulously refine their targeting computations for optimal accuracy. Lieutenant William Cassiday, serving with the distinguished 384th Bomb Group, meticulously documented in his personal diary the inaugural occasion his crew intentionally executed a climb directly into the formidable anti-aircraft fire over Frankfurt in February 1944. Their B-17 had settled into its steady bombing run at an altitude of 23,500 feet, when the initial, ominous bursts of flak began to blossom ahead of their formation. Diverging sharply from established operational doctrine, which typically prescribed maintaining a constant altitude during the bomb run, Cassiday initiated a gradual ascent. His co-pilot, understandably apprehensive, voiced concerns regarding the decision, as they appeared to be deliberately moving towards the dark, menacing clouds of explosions. Nevertheless, Cassiday steadfastly maintained his ascent rate at approximately 90 feet per minute. The very flak that had moments earlier been detonating at their initial altitude now consistently appeared below them, a testament to their successful evasion. The bombs were ultimately released from an elevation of 24,200 feet, and remarkably, the entire formation sustained no losses over the target area. Every single aircraft successfully returned to base. The efficacy of this novel maneuver was rooted in a fundamental, inherent limitation within the sophisticated German fire control system, specifically the Kommandogerät, which, despite its remarkable ability to compute highly accurate firing solutions, was incapable of instantaneous recalculation. Once the intricate tracking data was diligently fed into the predictor system and a comprehensive firing solution had been meticulously generated, there existed a critical time lag, typically ranging from 20 to 30 seconds, before any updated target information could be fully processed and assimilated into a fresh, revised solution. During this crucial interval, anti-aircraft shells, already pre-fitted with fuses set to detonate at a specific altitude derived from the now outdated data, were loaded and launched. These projectiles were irrevocably committed to exploding at an altitude calculated based on historical rather than real-time information. Consequently, if the target aircraft had undergone an altitude change during this extended processing and firing cycle, the incoming shells would inevitably detonate harmlessly in unoccupied airspace, their lethal intent rendered futile. We hope you are enjoying this deep dive into aerial tactics. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Also, feel free to leave a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The inherent delay in the shell's time of flight further augmented this protective mechanism, adding another critical layer of safety for the climbing bombers. For instance, an 82 mm anti-aircraft shell, launched from ground level towards an aerial target positioned at 25,000 feet, would typically experience a flight duration of approximately 28 to 32 seconds, contingent upon prevailing atmospheric conditions. Over this roughly 30-second period, a B-17 bomber steadily ascending at 100 feet per minute would gain a significant 500 feet in altitude. Therefore, while the incoming shell would dutifully arrive at the exact altitude where the predictor system had calculated the bomber would be, the aircraft itself would, in reality, be a full 500 feet higher. The lethal fragmentation pattern emanating from the exploding shell would typically disperse in a conical fashion, with the majority of its deadliest fragments traveling either horizontally or downwards from the burst point. By actively climbing, the bomber effectively positioned itself above this primary kill zone, dramatically reducing its vulnerability. Aircrews quickly began to articulate their observations of this distinctive flak phenomenon in vivid visual terms that rendered the concept remarkably clear and intuitive. They would watch, often with a mix of apprehension and dawning understanding, as enemy shells appeared to burst at what seemed to be their current altitude. Yet those explosions were, in fact, precisely where their aircraft had been merely moments before. One particularly insightful navigator famously likened the experience to observing footsteps relentlessly pursuing one up a winding staircase, with each deafening explosion marking the exact spot one had just vacated, always maintaining the crucial advantage of being one step ahead. The psychological ramifications of this discovery were profound and transformative. Time. Twos. Instead of enduring the terrifying experience of flying helplessly through an impenetrable barrage of enemy fire, pilots now harbored a powerful sense that they were actively, strategically defeating the German fire control system. They perceived themselves as ingeniously turning the very precision of the predictor against itself. The Kommandogerät, or Kommandogerät as it was sometimes known, continued to execute its intricate calculations with flawless accuracy. Yet it was calculating for an aircraft that, by the time the shells arrived, no longer existed at those specific coordinates. By March of 1944, this innovative altitude change tactic had successfully transitioned from isolated individual experimentation to formally adopted group-level doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commanding the distinguished 3rd Bomb Division, stood among the pioneering senior officers who formally sanctioned the widespread employment of this technique. After a thorough review of mission reports and comprehensive loss statistics, LeMay, an officer who had meticulously forged his formidable reputation through a consistent commitment to tactical innovation, promptly recognized an effective field innovation when it presented itself. He was, after all, the architect behind the renowned combat box formation, a strategic arrangement that provided B-17s with mutually overlapping and highly effective defensive fire. His pivotal operations order of March 12, 1944, explicitly granted group leaders the necessary discretion to implement altitude variations during bombing runs, accompanying this authorization with specific and detailed guidance regarding optimal timing and appropriate climb rates. Nevertheless, the widespread implementation of this novel approach was not entirely devoid of resistance from certain quarters. By-the-book operations officers, adhering strictly to established protocols, vociferously argued that any deviation whatsoever from stable-level flight would inevitably compromise the very precision that served as the foundational justification for undertaking perilous daylight bombing missions in the first place. Their contention was that if American bombers were to accept the inherently heavy losses associated with daylight operations, in stark contrast to the Royal Air Force's nocturnal bombing strategy, then those sacrifices absolutely had to yield demonstrably superior bombing accuracy. Major Harold Bowman, stationed at 8th Bomber Command Headquarters, submitted a pointed memo in early April, raising serious questions about whether altitude changes would degrade the circular error probable ACEP, the critical radius within which bombs were expected to fall, to unacceptably high levels. The memo specifically requested a temporary suspension of the tactic until proper exhaustive testing could be conducted at dedicated bombardier training facilities located within the United States. However, the combat crews themselves had already definitively settled that particular debate through the irrefutable evidence of practical, real-world results. Bombardiers, drawing upon their extensive operational experience, reported consistently that as long as the climb rate remained absolutely steady and did not exceed the critical threshold of 120 feet per minute, the Norden site's advanced gyroscopic stabilization and intricate rate mechanisms were fully capable of compensating for the aircraft's vertical movement. The bombardier would simply execute minor adjustments to his rate knobs, effectively treating the climb as yet another variable, much like wind drift or prevailing airspeed, that required consideration in his targeting solution. Lieutenant Thomas Farabee, who would later achieve immense historical fame as the bombardier aboard the Enola Gay, flew numerous missions with the 384th Bomb Group, consistently employing these innovative climb techniques. He reliably placed his bomb patterns well within the acceptable parameters of the target's mean point of impact, effectively demonstrating the tactic's viability. Consequently, training protocols underwent swift and necessary adaptation to incorporate this proven technique. New crews arriving in England during the spring of 1944 received comprehensive briefings that explicitly included the altitude change maneuver as an integral component of their standard target approach procedures. The guidance provided was meticulously specific, crews were instructed to initiate a steady climb precisely 150 seconds before the anticipated bombs away signal. They were to maintain a consistent climb rate situated between 80 and 110 feet per minute, and, crucially, they were to hold that rate absolutely constant throughout the designated period, to provide the bombardier with the most predictable and stable platform possible. Additionally, lead bombardiers, who bore the immense responsibility of determining the precise moment when entire formations would release their ordnance, were granted supplementary latitude to fine-tune the initiation timing of the climb based on real-time observations of enemy flak patterns and the discernible behavior of German tracking systems. The evolution of evasion tactics profoundly impacted tracking behavior. The proliferation of this ingenious method across the entire 8th Air Force occurred organically, spreading through the very fabric of the bomber stream itself. Air crews on missions frequently observed adjacent formations successfully employing climb techniques and subsequently noted a marked reduction in their vulnerability to flak damage during critical post-mission debriefing sessions. Back at their respective air bases, pilots and navigators would diligently compare their experiences, discussing in detail what maneuvers proved effective and which ones did not. A particularly compelling and widely discussed illustration of this effectiveness was the 91st Bomb Group's harrowing mission over Brunswick on April 8, 1944. During their final bomb run, this group initiated a decisive climb, ascending from an initial altitude of 24,000 feet to a new cruising height of 25,200 feet, while neighboring groups steadfastly maintained their original altitude. The climbing group emerged from the engagement with only 4 aircraft sustaining superficial flak damage, none of which were seriously compromised. In stark contrast, the formations that held their altitude suffered significantly, losing 3 bombers outright and having an additional 11 aircraft severely damaged. News of such striking disparities in combat outcomes disseminated far more rapidly and effectively through informal channels than any official directive or formal memo could ever hope to achieve. Beyond the fundamental climbing maneuver, some groups developed sophisticated variations on the basic technique, further refining their evasive capabilities. The 305th Bomb Group, for instance, pioneered an experimental climbing turn, ingeniously combining a rapid gain in altitude with a subtle yet crucial course adjustment during the final minute leading up to the release of their bombs. This innovative tactic introduced a lateral displacement, in addition to the vertical one, thereby compounding the difficulties for German predictor calculations. Other groups explored step climbs, where aircraft would maintain a steady altitude for approximately 30 seconds, then execute a swift 200-foot ascent before resuming a level flight path. However, a consensus eventually materialized, clearly favoring the steady, continuous climb as the most efficacious approach. The step climbs, it was observed, inadvertently provided German tracking crews with discernible patterns that could be fed into their predictors, offering moments of predictable data. Conversely, the steady, uninterrupted climb presented a constantly shifting stream of data, proving far more challenging for enemy fire control systems to process into accurate firing solutions against the moving targets. By May 1944, as the colossal preparations for the Normandy invasion reached a fever pitch, the altitude change technique had transitioned from an experimental maneuver to a fully entrenched standard operating procedure across the vast majority of the 8th Air Force's bomb groups. Mission planning documents from this period meticulously incorporated specific climb initiation points and designated target climb altitudes, integrating them with the same precision previously reserved for initial points and bomb release lines. Even nascent pilots, freshly arrived from the United States, were thoroughly indoctrinated in this critical technique during their initial orientation flights, often before they had even embarked on their very first combat mission. What had initially blossomed as an unauthorized deviation from established military doctrine had, through sheer combat necessity and proven effectiveness, become the very doctrine itself. The formidable bomber force had undergone a profound tactical evolution, adapting ingeniously to survive against a highly sophisticated German fire control system that just a few months prior had been relentlessly decimating Allied formations. This transformative shift was not the result of high-level strategic planning or top-down directives, but rather emerged from the collective, hard-won experience of countless aircrews who discovered an innovative way to outwit the mathematical equations that were, quite literally, designed to kill them. We hope you are staying with us and will watch the end of the video. We would be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The German forces, naturally, were not oblivious to the significant alterations occurring in the skies above their homeland. By the summer of 1944, reports from Flak battery commanders to their superiors consistently indicated that American bomber formations were no longer adhering to the predictable flight parameters during their critical bomb runs. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, through meticulous interrogation of captured B-17 crews, soon uncovered the details of these altitude change tactics, which had by then firmly become standard procedure within the Allied air forces. The pressing question that emerged for the German High Command was whether their sophisticated fire control systems could adapt with sufficient speed and efficacy to counter this rapid evolution in American aerial tactics. In response, the crews operating the formidable Commando Garrett Predictors diligently attempted several countermeasures. The most straightforward solution initially conceived was to significantly increase the frequency of tracking updates. Instead of feeding positional data to the mechanical predictor every 8 to 10 seconds, operators endeavored to accelerate this process, updating the system every 4 to 5 seconds. The underlying theoretical principle was sound. More frequent data inputs would theoretically enable the mechanical computer to detect any altitude changes sooner and subsequently recalculate firing solutions before the anti-aircraft shells were committed to their trajectory. In practical application, however, the human operators found it exceedingly difficult to reliably maintain such an accelerated pace. The arduous task of tracking a bomber at an altitude of 25,000 feet through optical rangefinders, while simultaneously calling out precise measurements every few seconds, inevitably led to severe fatigue and a corresponding increase in operational errors. Consequently, the overall quality and accuracy of the data degraded significantly whenever operators attempted to rush the process. German engineers, in parallel, diligently explored various modifications to the Commando Garrett system itself. Certain batteries were equipped with enhanced predictors, featuring additional calculating mechanisms specifically designed to detect the rate of climb and seamlessly integrate this variable into the firing solutions. These upgraded units, officially designated as Commando Garrett 4041, began to make their appearance at critically important target defenses located around Berlin and throughout the Ruhr Valley in mid-1944. While these technological improvements offered a marginal advantage, they ultimately proved incapable of surmounting the fundamental time lag problem inherent in anti-aircraft warfare. Even with superior calculations, anti-aircraft shells still required approximately 30 seconds to reach their operational altitude, during which interval the climbing bombers could easily gain another 500 feet. Although the predictor could estimate a climb rate, if the bomber subsequently altered that rate or ceased climbing altogether, the initial estimate would instantly become inaccurate and obsolete. Another experimental solution involved meticulously adjusting fuse settings to generate a deeper, more vertically oriented burst pattern. The established standard practice had traditionally involved setting fuses for precise altitude detonation, thereby creating a broad, horizontal fragmentation spread. German fuse technicians, however, began experimenting with staggered settings. Under this new approach, some shells were fused to detonate at the predicted altitude, while others were calibrated to explode 200 feet higher, and still others 400 feet higher. This innovative method was intended to create a vertical ladder of explosions designed to bracket a climbing bomber more effectively. The formidable 88mm batteries defending the vital Luna refineries notably employed this technique extensively during missions in September 1944. While this approach undeniably increased the sheer volume of steel propelled into the air, it simultaneously decreased the density of fragmentation at any single specific altitude, paradoxically reducing the overall hit probability against individual aircraft. Paradoxically, the most effective German counter tactic was not technological in nature, but rather procedural, an earlier engagement strategy. Flak batteries began to initiate their firing sequences at significantly greater ranges, engaging incoming bomber formations 8 to 10 miles from the target, instead of adhering to the previous practice of waiting until they were within 5 miles. This strategic shift compelled American pilots to commence their evasive climbs much earlier in their approach, which, in turn, afforded German tracking crews a more extended period to observe the altitude changes and input updated data into their predictors. Some batteries, particularly those defending heavily fortified targets like the synthetic oil plants at Luna, reported improved accuracy using this method. However, these longer engagement ranges introduced a new set of challenges. Shells had to traverse a greater expanse of atmosphere, which inevitably diminished their accuracy and overall effectiveness, even when the fuse settings were technically correct. German anti-aircraft doctrine also underwent a significant shift, gravitating towards the concept of barrage fire directed over predicted zones, rather than maintaining the precision tracking of individual aircraft. This represented a profound philosophical retreat from the sophisticated fire control principles that had initially rendered the Commando Garrett so exceptionally deadly. Instead of meticulously calculating precise intercepts for single targets, batteries were instructed to saturate entire volumes of airspace with a deluge of shells deployed at varied altitudes and with diverse fuse settings. This widespread technique was colloquially dubbed flak carpets by the Allied bomber crews, dense, impassable fields of explosive bursts that a formation had no choice but to fly through, regardless of any altitude changes they attempted. While potentially overwhelming, this approach consumed enormous quantities of precious ammunition and necessitated larger concentrations of anti-aircraft guns, resources that Germany's rapidly deteriorating industrial situation made increasingly difficult to sustain and provide. By the autumn of 1944, the efficacy of German anti-aircraft artillery, or Flak, had perceptibly diminished, notwithstanding the deployment of heavier gun concentrations safeguarding critical targets. Comprehensive statistical analysis conducted by the 8th Air Force Intelligence Unit revealed a significant reduction in bomber loss rates attributable to Flak, receding from the disastrous proportions observed in late 1943 to more manageable thresholds. Missions that previously would have resulted in the loss of approximately 20 aircraft in 1943 were now experiencing casualties of only 8 to 10. While altitude change tactics undeniably played a crucial role, they were not the sole determinant. Other contributing factors included an increase in fighter escort availability, the implementation of improved bomber formations, and a discernible decline in the training quality of German Flak crews. Nevertheless, this tactical adaptation demonstrably impaired the effectiveness of the German Predictor system. The Kommandogerät, as it was known, remained a potent instrument of defense until the cessation of hostilities, particularly when American formations committed navigational errors or mechanical failures, compelled bombers to adhere to predictable flight paths. Yet it never again achieved the predictive infallibility it had commanded in 1943. This technological advantage was ultimately countered not by superior American engineering, but by a shrewd tactical adjustment. The bomber crews had not vanquished the predictor system through advanced aircraft design, rather they had defeated it by refusing to conform to the flight behaviors its designers had anticipated. The empirical verification of climbing into the Flak became unequivocally clear once a sufficient volume of mission data had been amassed for rigorous scrutiny. Post-war investigations, meticulously carried out by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, systematically examined the attrition rates both preceding and following the widespread adoption of these altitude change tactics. The compiled data presented an unequivocal narrative. Bombing missions undertaken during the first half of 1944, which incorporated the climb techniques, demonstrated a reduction in losses attributable to anti-aircraft fire of approximately 15 to 30% when compared to analogous missions targeting similar objectives in late 1943. The precise variance in these figures was contingent upon the specific target defenses encountered and the proficiency with which formations executed their climbs. But the underlying statistical trend was indisputable. Further, more specific, detailed corroboration emerged from the individual records of various bomb groups. The 100th Bomb Group, for instance, which had regrettably earned the somber moniker Bloody Hundredth due to its ruinous attrition rates in 1943, witnessed its casualty figures ameliorate substantially after formally implementing climb procedures in March 1944. Between March and August of that year, the group successfully completed 87 combat missions, with a loss rate of 3.2% per mission, a figure still indicative of inherent danger, but markedly below the intolerable levels experienced during the preceding year. Their operations officer, Captain Robert Rosenthal, largely credited this amelioration to the synergistic effect of altitude tactics combined with enhanced fighter escort. Surviving crews from this distinguished group consistently cited the climb technique as a critical element that afforded them a viable opportunity against the merciless accuracy of predictor-directed fire. We would be extremely grateful if you would stay with us and watch the remainder of this video. Your like and subscription would be deeply appreciated. Please also consider leaving a comment below, letting us know where you are from, and sharing your thoughts on this compelling video topic. The influence of this technique extended its impact beyond merely immediate survival rates. It fundamentally altered how bomber crews perceived their own vulnerability. In 1943, anti-aircraft fire had been regarded as an indiscriminate phenomenon one simply suffered, much like adverse weather conditions. By mid-1944, however, crews gained the crucial understanding that they could proactively mitigate its threat through judicious flying. This cognitive transformation significantly boosted esprit de corps. Pilots felt less like vulnerable prey and more like active participants in a strategic engagement. Consequently, training programs began to emphasize this newfound agency. New crews were instructed that their role transcended simply piloting bombers. They were operating within a complex electronic and mechanical warfare environment where their calculated decisions could effectively neutralize enemy systems. The enduring legacy of climbing into the flak reached far beyond the confines of World War II. Air Force tactical development officers meticulously studied the technique's success when formulating operational guidelines for bomber deployments in subsequent conflicts. The core tenet that injecting variability into flight parameters could effectively defeat prediction-based fire control became a cornerstone of avoidance maneuvers. During the Korean War, for example, B-29 crews confronting Soviet-designed radar-directed Flak utilized adaptations of the altitude change technique. The fundamental physics remained consistent, even as the predictors themselves transitioned from purely mechanical computational devices to nascent electronic apparatuses. Even the advent of the jet age did not diminish the pertinence of this crucial lesson. Strategic Air Command's B-52 crews, throughout the Cold War, rigorously practiced low-level contour-hugging flight paths, constantly altering their flight elevation to introduce complexity into Soviet surface-to-air missile targeting algorithms. While these missiles were considerably faster than 88mm shells, and their guidance systems were electronic rather than mechanical, the underlying maxim endured. Constant altitude was inherently predictable, and predictability in combat was unequivocally lethal. Modern terrain-following radar and sophisticated automated flight control systems now execute the very same basic concept that B-17 pilots had discovered through practical observation above German territory. Maintain unpredictability within the operational parameters of your mission requirements. Indeed, even in the contemporary era of stealth technology and advanced standoff weapons, the fundamental strategic blueprint of climbing into the flak persists. Modern strike planning emphatically underscores the importance of diverse approach trajectories, eschewing routine aerial routes, and incorporating sudden erratic directional changes, known as jinking maneuvers, during terminal attack phases. While the specifics have naturally evolved alongside technological advancements, the fundamental rationale remains unchanged. Enemy fire control systems, whether they are antiquated mechanical predictors or cutting-edge phased array radars, demand predictable target behavior to achieve peak precision. Deny them that predictability, and their efficacy inevitably diminishes. The compelling narrative of B-17 pilots deliberately ascending into the Flak signifies a concept transcending a mere specific tactical innovation. It vividly illustrates the adaptive capacity of armed forces when established dogma confronts practical exigency, with the latter prevailing. The Army Air Forces had allocated substantial assets to developing a doctrine centered on precision daylight bombing. This doctrine had been rigorously tested, meticulously refined, and formally enshrined in instructional texts, representing the official sanctioned methodology for conducting aerial operations. However, when that approved method began decimating personnel at intolerable velocities, the organization exhibited sufficient malleability to transform. Innovation, in this instance, originated from the grassroots level, from pilots and crews who prioritized their experiential insights above prescribed procedures outlined in their training manuals. This crucial adaptation succeeded because leadership at multiple echelons acknowledged legitimate battlefield ingenuity and facilitated its dissemination. Senior commanders like General Curtis LeMay and others could have demanded unyielding conformity to established protocols, even resorting to court-martialing pilots who strayed from sanctioned methodologies. Instead, they scrutinized the empirical data, discerned its efficacy, and proceeded to institutionalize successful practices. That institutional adaptability, the receptiveness to instruction from the individuals actually engaged in the fighting, may have been as critical as the tactic itself. The crews discovered a means of preservation, and the command structure proved intelligent enough to permit its adoption. Thousands of airmen returned home from World War II because someone discerned the greater prudence in ascending into the bursting ordnance, rather than holding steady within the Predictors' predetermined lethal radius. The mathematical models indicated its infeasibility. Official tenets declared it erroneous, yet those who persevered attested to its functionality. That is the enduring legacy. Sometimes the manual is wrong, and preservation necessitates ingenuity irrespective of codified regulations.